There's been a relative shift in power from, say, if you're in the United States, between Wall Street and Silicon Valley. Actually, a lot of people who used to be aspire to work in finance are suddenly aspiring to work in Silicon Valley. It's an equally high status job all of a sudden, potentially even higher status than being a financial trader or Goldman Sachs employee. You know, to work for Google now is considered as prestigious. So you're finding this relative rearrangement of elites in these systems. But that said, what you're tending to see is not so much like banks turning into tech firms or the other way around. I mean, there's forms of fusion and hybridization going on both ways. De facto, the banks run the underlying financial infrastructure. A technology firm, for example, cannot move money around because they do not have a banking license. Apple cannot do, all of Apple's technology inevitably ends up back in the financial sector. So they might give you Apple Pay or something, but inevitably it's going to end up back, it's going to go through the banking sector in the end. But they're going to provide more layers now. So you're going to do it with your phone, and then they'll provide the sort of the on-ramp into the financial sector. Likewise, the financial firms themselves will be starting to build their own sort of interfaces into their systems. And they'll enter into deals with each other. So it's not really either way. I mean, when you hear these stories about, oh, in the future you won't need your banks. I mean, unless there's going to be a fundamental reordering of the money system, that's not going to be the case. In terms of the relationship between technology firms and the state, I mean, say Silicon Valley itself, which is one of the big tech sectors, comes out of military. The history of Silicon Valley is a military history. It all comes out of aerospace defense research, and so I mean, like Silicon Valley only really became this sort of like private thing in the 1970s, I think. Yeah, that's when you saw the venture capital type of stuff coming up. But prior to that, it was a large amount of military funding that essentially created this, yeah, but the state and these technology firms obviously have this type of interaction. So, for example, the corporations like Facebook have a profit incentive for building the technology, but then they happen to then build very useful pools of data for states to potentially use. This is what you find with like the NSA going through Facebook and stuff. Like the reason why Facebook has an incentive to get all that data is that they monetize it through advertising and various other things. But then they also happen to then have this useful side effect for states. But that said, there's also these kind of like looming tensions because if you look at companies like Google, they're actually gaining more data than states have ever had before. So, and they're now starting to market themselves to states as being, we can tell you about your populations. You can, we are the data experts. We know way more than you do, than your statistics departments. We can be the ones who will actually know how to apply machine learning and other types of big data methodologies to these data sets that we own. So I mean, for example, Google's got its sort of DeepMind center here in London, which is their AI unit that's doing sort of speculative AI stuff and stuff. But they also do these kind of like pilots with the NHS. It's like, give us your NHS data and we will tell you what's happening. So you could see this as being this kind of like either Google becoming like a quasi-public organization, or it's some kind of privatization and outsourcing of this type of work to a tech firm. If you believe, I mean, this is not all bad. There's some positive things you can do with this. But if you look at, say, cyberpunk fiction, which is the kind of dystopian science fiction that came out, in response to utopian visions of science and technology. One of the common strands that you always see in that type of science fiction is the fusion between corporations and government. Every single science fiction dystopia has that, where essentially corporations are the government, right? So, and it's to do with the sheer levels of scale they can get with technology. So that's the kind of the thing we have to try and avoid with these types of public-private partnerships. Blockchain technology comes out of a critique of centralization of power, especially centralization of power in the context of the internet, but not necessarily only the internet. So if you look at our modern society, how it's structured is you have millions of people who do not know each other, who are extremely interdependent upon each other. So a modern economy is very much just like you walk around the streets, you don't know anybody, but you're always interacting with them, right? And you always have to use these huge third-party institutions to facilitate that. So whether that be states that have sort of legal systems, or banks that are facilitating the money system, or the legal system itself, there's all these types of like institutions that enable these individuals to interact with each other without knowing each other. And that's especially acute in the context of the internet, where you're now dealing with like, huge numbers of people who you can't even see. Okay, so blockchain technology was this attempt to, or is an ongoing attempt to create systems where you can enable large numbers of strangers to interact with each other or keep track of each other's states relative to each other without relying upon this central party. The problem is, though, is that the main attempt is to replace like a human central party with some kind of technological protocol which is designed by somebody in particular, right? So often one of the key problems with blockchain technology is that you don't really necessarily remove power, you just sort of replace it with something else, right? So you replace a bank with some hard-coded protocol that some guy you don't know has designed, and it has a whole bunch of monetary policy decisions hard-coded into it. And then if you decide to use that, is that really that much better than using a central bank? You have to make these kind of decisions. But what it's certainly done is like opened up the potentiality for creating large-scale social systems without these central parties, and you might be able to apply that to stuff like, for example, a cooperative. So let's take Uber, for example. Uber right now is one of those giant centralized entities that enables strangers to interact. You could hypothetically imagine using a blockchain system to enable those drivers and users to form a sort of digital cooperative. So that's, there are some interesting potentialities in blockchain technology. At the same time, the negative side of it is that you could just end up with giant digital bureaucracies that nobody knows who's in control of them. All right, and it's difficult to know whether that's better than being subject to a giant digital bureaucracy where you know the person who controls it. So you've got to kind of decide whether what type of giant digital bureaucracy you want, because both Uber and a decentralized version of it will be giant digital bureaucracies. So do you want it centralized or decentralized? Bear in mind that this, in terms of like how you respond to these huge institutions in the age of the internet, the concept of decentralization, which is like thrown around a lot in blockchain technology scenes, is up for debate what it actually means. One vision of decentralization is create one giant infrastructure that nobody controls. That's like the blockchain concept. It's like create one giant, like the Bitcoin system or like the Ethereum system, but nobody's in control of it. So it's one system with no control or centralized control. The other alternative vision of decentralization, which has always existed, probably like exists way before this, is the idea of having multiple different systems that interact with each other. So federations of smaller systems. So if you look at, for example, the local currency movements or any kind of localist economics, any kind of like anarchist sort of autonomous types of movements, they have much more of that feeling to them, which is they say like, let's localize control of a smaller infrastructure, and then we can kind of like network them together in some kind of way. And that's always been a sort of another vision of decentralization that's existed for a long time. And so there's a lot of stuff happening in that area. Whether you could replace something like Uber with something like that, I really don't know. But certainly in, say, like money systems and stuff, there's a lot of experimentation around, more localist forms of money, and more localist forms of organizations and so on. One of the main problems, though, is that when you are operating in a gigantic, alienating global economy that rewards scale, trying to keep those small-scale things going in the face of the kind of like vortex of corporations is pretty difficult. You're working completely against the grain of the kind of like the network effects of the economy. In the end, this is, you know, we are underdogs in the system. The tendencies are towards gigantic mega corporations and dystopian futures, but, you know, that's just the way it is, and you've got to work with that. And, you know, it's fun.